Hey, settle in. Get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a little, pull that blanket up a little higher, and let the rest of the world outside go quiet for a while. Tonight we are going somewhere warm and very familiar. Two shows that have been woven into the fabric of late-night television for longer than most people stop to appreciate. Two animated comedies born from the same creator, set in very similar suburban worlds, built on very similar comedic foundations. And yet somehow, across the same 20-plus years, one of them quietly became something extraordinary, while the other became a distant, hollowed-out echo of what it used to be. We are talking about American Dad and Family Guy. And the argument tonight is a simple one, made with patience and with as much specific detail as the subject deserves. American Dad is the better show. Not because Family Guy was never good, it was genuinely great for a real, significant period of time. And that greatness was earned and meaningful and left a mark on the history of television. But because what Family Guy used to be and what American Dad quietly became over 20 years are two very different things, and the distance between them grows clearer and more striking the more closely and honestly you look. So let us look closely and honestly. Section 1. Two shows, one creator, two very different fates. The year is 1999. A 25-year-old animator with a portfolio full of ideas and a specific, irreverent sensibility walks into Fox Broadcasting and pitches a show about a working-class family in a fictional Rhode Island town called Quahog. The father is overweight, well-meaning, and reliably dim. Easily distracted by whatever is immediately in front of him. Constitutionally incapable of thinking more than one step ahead. The kind of person who means well in a way that rarely translates into actually doing well. The mother is patient and warm and quietly holding everything together while chaos swirls around her. The baby is a secret supervillain with a British accent and a crib full of weapons. The family dog drinks martinis, drives a car, and is by some margin the most functional person in the household. The whole thing is fast and weird and confident, and it gets a slot right after Super Bowl 33, one of the most valuable positions in all of American television. That animator is Seth MacFarlane. The show is Family Guy. It premiered on January 31st, 1999. The first episode pulled in roughly 22 million viewers, which is an enormous number for any new show in any era, and announced the arrival of something genuinely new in the animated comedy space. But the early story of Family Guy is not a smooth success arc, and understanding the rocky road it traveled is important context for everything that came later. Fox, for reasons genuinely difficult to defend in retrospect, kept moving the show around the schedule during its first 3 seasons without ever giving it the time to build a stable audience. In the second season, they placed it on Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, directly opposite Frasier on NBC, which was at the time one of the most consistently watched comedies in the country, in the absolute prime of its cultural moment. The ratings dropped hard. Fox moved it again to Tuesday nights, where it competed against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on a BC, which was pulling massive numbers during the early fever of the game show revival. Family Guy lost that competition too. The network kept shuffling the show between time slots without adequate advance notice, making it nearly impossible for a casual viewer to find it reliably week to week. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. It looked final. When a show gets canceled, it almost always stays canceled. Getting one second chance in television is rare enough to be notable. Getting a third is essentially unheard of. And then something happened that nobody expected. Cartoon Network bought the rerun rights to air Family Guy on their Adult Swim late-night block. They acquired those rights for almost nothing because at the time, nobody thought the show had meaningful residual value. A canceled cartoon from Fox that had failed to hold its audience against network competition, why would that be worth very much? The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. Almost overnight, Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire block, boosting Adult Swim's total viewership by 239%. Something extraordinary had happened. The people who had never managed to find the show during its original network run discovered it in the late-night quiet of cable television, and they loved it. They told other people. Those people found it too. Simultaneously, DVD sets of the first 2 seasons came out and sold over 400,000 copies, a massive number for a canceled cartoon that was supposedly dead. A loyal, passionate, genuinely enthusiastic fan base had formed in the 3-year absence of new episodes, and they were persistent enough and vocal enough to eventually change a network's mind. Fox noticed. In 2004, they ordered new episodes. Family Guy returned for its 4th season on May 1, 2005, as the centerpiece of Fox's Sunday night animation domination block, airing alongside The Simpsons and King of the Hill in a brand new Seth MacFarlane creation called American Dad. The return was enormous. The hype was genuine and intense. Family Guy had done something that almost never happens in the industry. It came back from the dead twice, carried there entirely by the strength of its audience's love. It was one of the genuine fairy tale stories in the history of American television, and even people who were ambivalent about the show's quality could not help but be impressed by the sheer stubbornness of its survival. Now, on that same Sunday night in February 2005, while the television world was celebrating Family Guy's return, something quieter was also premiering for the first time. American Dad had been conceived by MacFarlane and co-creators Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman in the wake of the 2000 United States presidential election and the sharp, anxious national division it represented. A moment that seemed to call urgently for satire. Fox had ordered a pilot presentation in September 2003, and the show was built from the beginning specifically for the animation domination block. The world the show created was different from Family Guy's in ways that were visible on the surface and deeper ways that only revealed themselves over time. Stan Smith is a CIA agent in the fictional suburb of Langley Falls, Virginia. Aggressively patriotic, rigidly conservative, absolutely certain of his own importance in every room he walks into. He applies the same blunt certainty to his domestic life that he applies to international threats, with reliably disastrous results. His wife Francine is warm and funny with a hidden wild streak that surprises people who only see the pleasant suburban surface. His daughter Haley is a passionate liberal activist whose every conversation with her father becomes a microcosm of the culture wars, conducted with the specific heat that only comes when two people who genuinely love each other cannot agree on anything. His son Steve is nerdy, earnest, socially aspirational, and cheerfully undeterred by his consistent failure to achieve the coolness he so clearly desires. In The Attic lives Roger, a gray-skinned alien that Stan rescued from government captivity at Area 51, flamboyant beyond description, amoral in ways that become immediately evident, constitutionally incapable of doing anything without making it entirely about himself. In a fishbowl on the kitchen counter lives Klaus, the family's fish, who is actually a former East German Olympic skier whose brain the CIA transplanted into a goldfish body in 1986 to prevent him from winning a gold medal at the Winter Olympics. On paper, American Dad looked like a lesser version of Family Guy. Critics said so. Early reviews were lukewarm. Audiences watched it because it aired right after the show they actually came to see, and the general assumption in the television world was unmistakable. Family Guy was the flagship, and American Dad was the backup plan, the side project, the brand extension. That assumption would be proved completely and spectacularly wrong. Embedded in American Dad's premise and in the creative philosophy of the people making it were qualities that Family Guy had in some measure and was gradually losing. A commitment to genuine storytelling, to character consistency, to the slow, patient accumulation of emotional truth that makes audiences invest in fictional people over the long term. American Dad would not only maintain those qualities, but deepen and expand them across 20 seasons, producing its most ambitious and honest work in seasons that came a decade and more after its premiere. The show everyone dismissed as the warm-up act for the show they actually wanted to see would quietly, methodically, without fanfare or fuss, become the better show. And the record of exactly how and why that happened is what we are going to trace tonight, in detail, with as much care as the subject deserves. The history of why American Dad became what it became and why Family Guy became what it became is not a story about talent. Seth MacFarlane is genuinely talented. The writers who worked on both shows were and are skilled professionals. The voice performances are extraordinary across both casts. None of the factors that determined which show would age well have anything to do with individual ability. They have everything to do with philosophy, with what you decide a show is for, with what questions you keep asking as you make it, year after year, season after season. Family Guy settled on a philosophy that prioritized reaction. The audience reacts to a cutaway gag. The audience reacts to Peter doing something outrageous. The audience reacts to a shocking moment of graphic violence or crude humor. The reaction is the goal. Whether the audience likes the characters or wants them to be okay, or feels anything lasting after the episode ends. These stopped being questions the show was actively asking. American Dad settled on a different philosophy, that the characters are the point, and the comedy follows from the characters. That the audience's investment in a show is built from the same material as their investment in real people. You care because you understand someone, because you have watched them face difficulty, because you know what they want and what they fear and what they are likely to do when the pressure increases. That investment, once made, is real and durable. It compounds. It generates loyalty that sustains a show through rough patches and ambitious experiments and 20-plus seasons of trying to keep the thing alive. These are not compatible philosophies, and the two shows, across the same stretch of time, demonstrated exactly what follows from each one. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing where these videos reach people. And if you are enjoying the atmosphere of tonight's video, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it keeps this channel alive. Section 2. The Cutaway Problem. How a signature device became a crutch. There is a moment that happens in almost every episode of later-era Family Guy that you can feel arriving before it actually does. A character says something like, "This reminds me of the time I..." And before the sentence can finish, before anyone else can respond, before the scene has a chance to breathe or develop in any direction, the screen cuts to a completely unrelated visual. Maybe it is a 30-second sketch. Maybe it is a 2-minute parody. Maybe, and this happened multiple times across the show's run, it is a completely unedited performance by a real country singer performing one of his actual songs while the audience sits there waiting for a punchline that is simply never going to come. And then, without transition or acknowledgement, the show cuts back to where it was, as though nothing interrupted it. This is the cutaway gag. It is the most famous, most discussed, most imitated, and most analyzed comedic device in Family Guy's entire history. It is also, when you trace the arc of the show's quality, honestly across 20-plus years, one of the clearest and most consequential indicators of exactly what went wrong. In the beginning, in those first 3 seasons that fans discuss with genuine, unqualified nostalgia, the cutaways were something categorically different from what they became. They were short. Most lasted only a handful of seconds. They functioned as bonus material layered on top of scenes that were already working independently of them, not as a replacement for the scene, but as an additional texture, a sprinkle of something extra on top of a meal that was already good. You could have removed every cutaway from a first-season episode and still had a complete, funny, satisfying piece of television. The stories had real beginnings and real middles and real ends. The characters had arcs that played out within individual episodes. The cutaways were the seasoning on a dish that did not require them to taste good. The early cutaways also had a quality of specific intention behind them. They grew from actual lines of dialogue. They were connected, even if loosely, even if absurdly, to something happening in the specific scene. A specific character said something specific, and the cutaway illustrated or amplified that specific thing in a way that was funnier than expected because a writer had actually thought about the connection. There was craft behind them. Not just random assembly, but a specific comedic intelligence matching a visual to a verbal moment in a way that landed cleanly and moved on. Then the show came back from cancellation in 2005, and something shifted in the writing room that never fully corrected itself. Part of what happened is structural. The original writing team had scattered during the 3-year cancellation gap. When a show ends, the writers move on. They find other projects. They develop other habits and other instincts about what works. When Family Guy came back, some original writers returned, but new ones came in too, and new writers bring new sensibilities about what the show should prioritize. What the new approach prioritized increasingly and quite rapidly was the cutaways themselves. Not the storytelling, not the character dynamics, not the warmth beneath the comedy. The cutaways, because they were the most visible, most shareable, most easily isolated element of what the show did. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned, and the synergy between the show's cutaway format and the emerging culture of online video sharing was immediate and powerful. A 30-second Family Guy clip was perfect internet content a decade before anyone had fully articulated what internet content meant. You could clip it, upload it, share it, watch it out of context with no prior knowledge of the show, and the joke still landed. The cutaway format was pre-optimized for viral distribution in ways that the show's storytelling, emotional warmth, and character work simply were not. So the writers leaned into them, harder and harder, season by season. The cutaways grew longer and appeared more frequently. The main storylines of episodes grew progressively thinner because the writers discovered you could fill 22 minutes with disconnected gags rather than having to construct and maintain an actual plot. By the middle and later seasons, there were episodes where removing every cutaway would leave perhaps 9 or 10 minutes of actual story in a 22-minute episode. The cutaways had stopped supporting the show. They had replaced it. They were no longer seasoning. They had become the whole meal, and the meal itself had disappeared. The cutaway problem also reveals itself in how the two shows handle time within their episodes. When Family Guy relies on cutaways to fill its runtime, the episodes develop a specific, deadening rhythm. Burst of story, escape to cutaway, return to story, escape again. That prevents any scene from developing momentum. Comedy benefits enormously from momentum. A running joke gets funnier as it builds. A dramatic situation gets more tense as it develops. A character's emotional state becomes more interesting as you watch it accumulate across a scene. Cutaways interrupt all of this before it can build into anything. Every escape to a random gag resets the emotional clock back to zero. American Dad, without this escape available, is forced to let its scenes develop. The comedy has room to build. The characters have room to react to each other, rather than simply triggering each other's setups. South Park made this exact criticism in their 2006 two-part episode Cartoon Wars, depicting Family Guy's creative process as manatees randomly pushing concept balls together. The implication being that the comedy required no actual craft, and that any cutaway could be swapped with any other cutaway without the show changing in any meaningful way, because the cutaways had no genuine relationship to the story or characters around them. They were interchangeable decorations on an increasingly featureless surface. The show itself was aware of this problem, in the self-aware way that later-era Family Guy is aware of its own issues without actually addressing them. There was an episode called Back to the Pilot, featuring a meta-joke about characters standing around doing nothing during cutaways because they have no function during them. There was an entire episode called Cutaway Land, built around the premise of traveling through Cutaway World, an episode that ended up recycling old material and concluded with Peter waking from a dream, one of the most exhausted endings in all of storytelling. The episode meant to celebrate the show's signature device accidentally became a perfect illustration of what had gone wrong with it. The Conway Twitty gag is the most notorious, specific example of the cutaway problem at its worst. Multiple times across multiple seasons, Family Guy simply cut to an unedited Conway Twitty performance. Not a parody, not a reference, just the real thing playing out while the audience waited. The first appearance had a kind of dark audacity to it. By the third and fourth, it had become universally recognized as exactly what it was: a writing staff padding the runtime with licensed footage rather than actual comedy. Now set all of that against American Dad. American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This is not a stylistic preference or a surface-level aesthetic choice. It is a foundational philosophical commitment that shapes everything about how the show works at every level, and it explains more about the quality gap between the two shows than almost any other single factor you could identify. Without the ability to cut away when a scene is not working, the American Dad writing staff had no safety net whatsoever. Every moment of every episode had to carry its own weight within the actual story. Every funny moment had to come from the characters themselves, from the situations the plot placed them in, from the specific and carefully built weirdness of the world the show had constructed. There was nowhere to hide. This enforced something on the writing process that the Family Guy room, with its reliable escape valve, never had to develop. It required knowing the characters deeply enough to generate comedy from them directly. It required building plots that were genuinely interesting enough to carry a full episode. It required trusting that an audience given good characters in a good situation would stay engaged without constant external stimulation. It required, in short, writing. And the result, sustained over 20-plus seasons, is a show where individual episodes feel like complete experiences from beginning to end. You watch an American Dad episode and something actually happens. There is a setup and a complication and a resolution that follow naturally and specifically from who the characters are and what they want. The humor is woven through the fabric of the story rather than bolted to its side. In the best episodes, the humor and the story are indistinguishable from each other. This is not to pretend that Family Guy's cutaways were never funny. Many of them were brilliant, especially in the early seasons. Some of the most widely shared animated comedy clips from the mid-2000s came from Family Guy cutaway gags, and the show's format was genuinely well-calibrated to the emerging digital sharing culture of that era. There is a version of the argument that gives Family Guy full credit for this, and it deserves it. But there is a difference, a profound, enduring, sustaining difference, between a show that creates great moments and a show that tells great stories. Family Guy became entirely about the moments. Individual clips, individual gags, individual reactions. American Dad kept its attention on the whole. The complete experience of watching 22 minutes of American Dad is qualitatively different from the same experience with Family Guy. One tells you a story, the other performs a variety show with familiar faces and no connective tissue between the acts. Section 3. Character decay and character consistency. Peter Griffin versus Stan Smith. There is a word that has become essential vocabulary for anyone who follows long-running television seriously, and that word is Flanderization. It takes its name from Ned Flanders of The Simpsons, a character who began as a genuinely warm, multi-dimensional neighbor, whose strong faith was one ingredient in a rich and specific personality, and who over many seasons was slowly compressed until every scene he appeared in was about and only about being religious. The person disappeared. Only the trait remained, amplified past the point of recognition or nuance. Flanderization is when a character who was once complex gets reduced to one or two extreme qualities repeated without variation, until they barely resemble who they were at the beginning. And Family Guy is widely considered one of the worst offenders of Flanderization in the history of animated television. The show's central characters, especially Peter Griffin, went through transformations so dramatic and so sustained that watching the early seasons alongside the later ones can feel like watching two entirely different programs that happen to share names and visual designs. Peter Griffin is where this examination must begin, because he is the center of the show and his transformation is therefore the most consequential for everything else. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Peter was a type that animation and domestic comedy had used many times before, but that the show made feel fresh and specific through a combination of sharp writing and genuine warmth. He was the lovable idiot dad, overweight, not intelligent, prone to terrible decisions, easily distracted by whatever was immediately in front of him, incapable of considering consequences beyond the most immediate horizon. But underneath the stupidity was a real warmth. Peter loved Lois, not performatively, not when it was convenient, but actually and durably and in ways that showed up in specific moments, rather than being merely asserted. He loved his children. When he messed up, which was constantly and spectacularly, the show honored that failure by giving Peter the consequence of it. He would realize what he had done. He would feel bad about it in the specific, unelaborated way that a not very smart man feels bad, not with sophisticated emotional language, but with the plain, uncomfortable weight of knowing he had hurt someone he did not want to hurt. And then he would try to make it right. He would apologize. He would do something clumsy and sincere. He would hug Lois and mean it. That cycle, the mess, the realization, the repair, is what made Peter watchable through 2 or 3 seasons of reliably bad decisions. The comedy came from the mess. The heart came from the repair. The balance between them was what made the character work. and what made him someone you could actually care about despite everything he continuously did wrong. Starting around season 4, that balance began to tilt. By season 8, it had collapsed completely. The intelligence eroded first. In the early seasons, Peter was foolish in a grounded, human way. He made bad choices because he lacked foresight, because his sense of cause and effect was imprecise. But he was recognizably a person. He could hold a job. He could maintain friendships. He could navigate the basic requirements of adult life, however badly. By the later seasons, his intelligence had dropped so far below any realistic baseline that the show began presenting him as someone incapable of performing basic cognitive functions, unable to retain information from one moment to the next, operating in a kind of permanent moral vacuum where the feelings and well-being of the people around him simply did not register. But the intelligence drop was the smaller problem. The larger one was the cruelty. Peter went from a man who did stupid things with unintentional consequences to a man who did deliberately harmful things and felt nothing about them afterward. He would push Lois into water he believed contained a shark so he could escape in the boat. He would steal Halloween candy from his own infant son. He would actively sabotage the marriages of his closest friends out of apparent spite. He would spend extended scenes physically tormenting Meg in ways that moved well past inattentive parenting into something that would warrant genuine intervention in any real family situation. And the show played all of this as comedy, not as character failures the story would examine, but as the punchline itself, as though the cruelty were the point. In the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg stands up to her family and delivers a speech in which she catalogs, clearly and accurately, every terrible thing that has been done to her. She calls Peter completely selfish and totally irresponsible. She says he has physically abused her for entertainment, that if anyone outside the family could see how he treated her, he would be in jail. Every accusation is accurate. The show has aired every example she describes. She is not exaggerating. Peter's response is to laugh. Not guilty laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. Pure, uncomplicated amusement that his daughter has articulated the record of his cruelty toward her. Nothing in him registers this as something worth sitting with. There is a specific episode that illustrates the full distance between the two shows' approaches to character in a single comparison. In Family Guy's season 12 episode Life of Brian, Brian Griffin is killed. The death is presented as emotional and significant. Fans reacted with real grief. It made national news. And then, just 2 episodes later, Stewie goes back in time and saves Brian. Everything resets. The reaction from fans was immediate and furious, not primarily because they were unhappy Brian had returned, but because the show had revealed exactly what its emotional stakes actually were: 0. The audience had been invited to feel something genuine and then told 2 episodes later that the feeling had been manufactured for ratings purposes and could now be discarded. Big things could happen, but nothing would stick. Nothing would matter. Stan Smith has never been subjected to this treatment. When something changes for Stan, when he learns something, when he loses something, when he has a moment of genuine reckoning, the show treats those changes as real. The consequences accumulate. The person is different, even if only slightly, from one year to the next. And unlike Peter Griffin, Stan is always in genuine relationship with his own failings. The gap between who he believes himself to be and who he actually is generates the show's comedy and also its feeling. There is also a quality of consistency in American Dad that benefits every character beyond Stan. Francine is still Francine across 20 seasons, still warm, still funny, still possessed of the same blind spots and the same genuine love. Haley is still Haley, still fighting, still right sometimes and wrong sometimes. Steve is still Steve, still eager and awkward and quietly endearing. Klaus is still Klaus, still German, still aggrieved, still in the fishbowl. These characters have developed, but they have not been replaced. You can watch an episode from season 3 and an episode from season 18 and recognize the same people in both. This is a simple thing to say and an enormously difficult thing to maintain across 2 decades of television. Section 4. Roger the Alien, a creative concept without limit. If you asked a large and genuinely honest sample of dedicated American Dad fans to name the single element that made the show great, the thing that would have been most difficult to replicate anywhere else, the invention that set the show apart most clearly from everything else in adult animation, a significant majority would tell you it was Roger. Roger the alien is, in concept, not especially complicated. He is an extraterrestrial who crash-landed at Roswell in 1947, spent decades in government captivity at Area 51, was rescued at personal risk by CIA agent Stan Smith, and now lives in the Smith family attic, concealing his alien nature from everyone outside the household. He is gray-skinned, large-eyed, and flamboyant in ways that exceed easy description. He is immoral in ways that become immediately evident upon meeting him. He is self-interested on a scale that occasionally crosses into what would clinically be described as sociopathy. He is possessed of such complete confidence in his own exceptional importance and talent that the gap between his self-image and his actual behavior is itself a renewable source of comedy that 20 seasons have not exhausted. He also drinks constantly. He has extremely strong and detailed opinions about food, fashion, celebrity culture, revenge, and the correct way to respond to perceived slights, which is always disproportionately, always theatrically, and always in a way that makes the situation considerably worse before it gets better, if it gets better at all. He is deeply and sincerely emotional about things that do not warrant emotion and entirely unmoved by things that genuinely warrant concern. He is, by any measure, a difficult person to know and an absolute nightmare to live with. And the Smiths tolerate him because Stan owes him his life and because, despite everything, there is something about Roger that functions as a kind of strange and unreliable center of gravity for the household. What makes Roger extraordinary? What lifts him from an interesting supporting character with a memorable visual design into one of the most creative and conceptually rich characters in the history of animated television is the persona system. Starting in the show's early seasons and accelerating substantially once the writers understood what they actually had, Roger developed the ability to adopt complete, fully realized alternate identities. Not just disguises or costumes. Full human characters with names, backstories, speech patterns, professional histories, ongoing relationships with people entirely outside the Smith family, and sometimes entire ongoing lives that existed in parallel to his life in the attic, without the Smiths having any awareness of them until those lives came crashing into theirs. By the time the show had been running for 10 or 15 years, Roger had accumulated hundreds of documented personas. There was Ricky Spanish, his darkest and most nihilistic alter ego, a man with a reputation so catastrophically bad that even Roger, who created him, seemed genuinely unsettled by the specifics of what Ricky had apparently done. Ricky Spanish is wanted in multiple jurisdictions. When the show devoted an episode to the Ricky Spanish persona, Steve briefly believes he can be redeemed, that underneath the terrible reputation is a person capable of change. The episode's conclusion, in which Steve discovers exactly how wrong he has been, functions as dark comedy about the limits of optimism when confronted with genuine, unrepentant evil. There was also Sidney Huffman, essentially Roger's shadow self, all the good impulses he suppresses in daily life made flesh. A kind, warm, generous man who helps people and asks nothing in return. The show used Sidney brilliantly to explore what Roger would actually be if he were not continuously dragged back toward selfishness by his own alien nature. There was the Legman, who partners with Steve's paraplegic character Wheels in recurring buddy cop parody episodes. There was Tearjerker, the Bond villain from one of the show's finest violent hours. There were Italian restaurant owners, grief counselors, high school guidance counselors, country music stars, fraudulent doctors, aerobics instructors, and at least one persona who apparently opened a small local business and ran it for years before Roger remembered he existed. The creative power of this system is difficult to overstate. It gave the writing staff an essentially infinite source of new stories. Any genre the show wanted to operate in, any setting, any tone, Roger could enter it as precisely whatever character that story required. The comedy in every Roger storyline is always comedy about this specific alien's relationship to human behavior and human pretension. Always particular, always anchored to the established reality of who Roger is, never random. The origin of the persona system is worth understanding. The show's creators have explained that Roger was originally conceived along the lines of ALF. The beloved 80s sitcom alien who lived with a suburban family was mostly confined to the house and commented on human behavior from the outside. In American Dad's first season, Roger functioned roughly that way. The ALF concept has a natural ceiling. An alien who stays home and reacts does not have room to grow into a primary storytelling engine. The breakthrough came from the decision to let Roger inhabit the outside world through disguise. Once that door opened, the writers discovered that the personas were not just a comedy device, they were a storytelling engine. Every new character Roger inhabited could generate its own plot, its own relationships, its own specific flavor of chaos. And because Roger remained consistent underneath every mask, always the same alien, governed by the same appetites and fears and self-serving calculations, every persona carried the same emotional signature even while looking and sounding entirely different. Roger is always Roger. The masks are infinite. The persona system also gave American Dad a structural advantage that Family Guy never developed. A character who could function as the main protagonist, the antagonist, the comic relief, the emotional center, or the chaos agent of any episode without ever feeling inconsistent. Roger in villain mode and Roger in friend mode and Roger in heartbroken mode are all the same Roger. The same selfishness and vanity and buried tenderness operating in different registers. The range is built into the character's design rather than being forced onto a character whose established identity limits them. This is in direct contrast to what happened with Stewie Griffin. Stewie's early design was similarly capable of operating across a wide range. The evil genius baby whose plans ranged beyond from domestic assassination attempts to world domination, capable of carrying any episode that needed a specific flavor of menacing intelligence applied to an absurd situation. When the writers decided that the evil genius routine had run its course and replaced it with a softer, more emotional Stewie, the show gained warmth but lost singularity. There was only one evil genius baby who built laser guns in his crib. That character was irreplaceable. The replacement version, emotional, identity-exploring, adventure-seeking, was one of dozens of animated characters with similar profiles. Roger was designed to never have this problem. Because Roger can be anyone, there is no original Roger to walk away from. The character evolves not by abandoning what he was, but by discovering new expressions of what he has always been, and that design choice, built into the conceptual level by writers who understood what they had, is one of the clearest examples of the kind of long-view thinking that distinguishes American Dad's best creative decisions from the more reactive choices that shaped Family Guy's trajectory. By the 200th episode, titled The 200, the show brought all of Roger's personas into existence simultaneously during an apocalyptic event. Each one was an independent being carrying the specific history Roger had built for them across hundreds of episodes. The episode used this as both a celebration of the show's accumulated creative history and as a genuine meditation on what it means to be made of all the selves you have pretended to be, on whether the real self is the thing underneath the masks or the entire collection of masks themselves. It was ambitious and strange and funny and occasionally touching, and it worked completely because 20 seasons of groundwork had been laid for exactly this moment. No character in Family Guy comes close to providing this kind of creative richness across a comparable span. Section 5. Stan Smith's Heart, the emotional core that never broke. There is something that happens in genuinely good television, a specific quality of moment that is very difficult to manufacture deliberately and very easy to lose through neglect. And that is the moment when a character whose flaws you know deeply and specifically does something that reveals the person underneath the flaw. Not a full redemption arc, not a lesson that resolves everything, just a glimpse, a brief, unguarded window into who the person actually is when the defenses drop and something real comes through. These moments are what make audiences invest in fictional people at all. They are the thing that cannot be faked. American Dad delivers these moments with Stan Smith on a regular basis, and they land convincingly because the show never allows you to forget what Stan's flaws cost his family. The moments of emotional openness feel earned because you have watched Stan fail first, specifically, repeatedly, in ways that are documented and consistent with his established psychology. You have watched him bulldoze through Francine's feelings, dismiss Haley's concerns, and misunderstand Steve's needs. The glimpses of genuine feeling are surrounded by context that gives them weight they would not otherwise have. The episode Rapture's Delight, which sits at the top of nearly every ranking of the show's best episodes, is the supreme expression of all of this. The episode begins on a completely ordinary comedic note. Stan cannot get a good seat at Christmas church service because he and Francine took a private moment together in a janitor's closet while looking for parking. And during that moment, the rapture occurred. The congregation ascended to heaven. Stan and Francine are left behind, among those found unworthy. The first act plays this as comedy. Stan furiously tries to logic his way into heaven from Earth, treating a cosmic spiritual event like a bureaucratic obstacle that should yield to sufficient persistence. It is completely recognizable. It is exactly who Stan is. And then the commercial break hits, and the episode makes the most audacious structural move in the show's history. 7 years pass. The tribulation has reduced civilization to ruins. Cities are post-apocalyptic wasteland, and Stan has become something close to a Mad Max figure. An eye patch over one destroyed eye, one hand replaced with a blade, riding a motorcycle through rubble. He is still technically alive but barely present. There is nothing left in him that resembles the man from the first act. The reason for this is Francine. After the rapture, Stan cared more about his own status with God than about being genuinely present with her, and she left him for it. She met Jesus Christ in his second coming and chose him over Stan. Stan has spent 7 years knowing that his wife chose actual Jesus over him. This is dark comedy of the highest order, and the show is honest about what that loss has done rather than simply mining it for jokes. When Stan and Francine are finally reunited in the climactic sequence, when Stan is dying of a wound he received protecting both Jesus and Francine from the Antichrist, Francine reaches for him and sees something small but enormously significant. He is wearing their wedding rings on a chain around his neck. Both of them. Her ring, the one she left behind when she left him, alongside his own. He kept it. He has worn both rings against his chest for 7 years. Through the apocalypse, through the war, through the complete unraveling of the world they shared. He kept her ring close to his heart. He never let go. He dies. He is admitted to his personal heaven, and his personalized heaven turns out to be the morning of the very day the episode began. Before everything went wrong, before the rapture, before the argument. Francine getting dressed in the other room, the world intact. Being late for church because he was with her, not power or recognition. Not even theological heaven as a concept, just the ordinary, the familiar, her. This is one of the genuinely moving moments in the history of adult animated comedy, and it works because the show spent the entire episode establishing what Stan lost through his own specific characteristic failure, and then paying that loss off with an image so simple and so true that you could not have invented it without knowing this particular man deeply. The comedy and the grief are made of the same material. The wedding rings are funny for exactly the reason they are devastating. Stan, the most self-seriously masculine man in America, secretly wearing both wedding rings like a lovesick teenager for 7 years of post-apocalyptic warfare. The image is simultaneously absurd and completely heartbreakingly honest. Peter Griffin cannot have this moment. The emotional architecture that would support it, the genuine love for his wife that would make his grief real, the sustained fidelity across 7 years that would make the rings meaningful, had been stripped out of the character through years of creative decisions that prioritized extreme behavior over emotional coherence. Stan's emotional story runs through the entire series in smaller ways too. There is the episode Man in the Moon Bounce, in which Stan decides his son Steve's childhood is officially over at 14, mirroring the way his own absent father forced him to grow up too fast. Stan pushes Steve toward adult responsibilities while secretly finding himself at a minimum security facility that is essentially summer camp for adults, finally having the childhood he was denied. When he sees how his absence is aging Steve prematurely, he gets out, walks home, picks Steve up, and carries him to the backyard where the birthday party equipment is still set up. He gives Steve back his childhood at the cost of his own brief, stolen version of one. The episode is funny and tender in the same breath, in the way that the best American Dad episodes consistently are. There is also Stan's relationship with Roger, which functions as a kind of emotional education conducted entirely without Stan's awareness. Roger is selfish and theatrical and willing to use everyone around him, but he is also capable of genuine affection for Stan in ways that surprise both of them. The friendship is dysfunctional by any conventional measure and also genuinely mutual in ways that matter when it counts. It is one of the more honest portraits of what real friendship between difficult people looks like. Not idealized, not uncomplicated, but real in the specific way that things are real when they have been tested. All of these threads, Stan and Steve, Stan and his absent father Jack, Stan and Roger, Stan and Francine, Stan and Haley, are maintained and developed simultaneously across 20 seasons. They do not always move in the same direction. They do not always resolve in satisfying ways. But they are alive. They are the ongoing texture of a show that keeps asking whether its main character is a good person and keeps providing enough evidence on both sides of the question to keep the inquiry genuinely interesting season after season. Section 6. The art of the story. Structure, comedy, and why the difference matters. Let us get specific about what actually happens inside each of these shows from a structural standpoint, because the difference between them is one of the most measurable demonstrations of the quality gap. A typical later Family Guy episode follows a pattern that has grown increasingly self-parodic in its consistency. There is a thin premise. A character says a line that functions as a cutaway trigger. The cutaway plays. The show returns to the premise. Another trigger line. Another cutaway. This continues, with the actual story receiving perhaps 4 or 5 minutes of total attention in a 22-minute episode. The resolution, when it comes, is usually rushed, the show remembering it needs to technically resolve the premise before the credits roll, rather than having genuinely arrived anywhere worth being. Within this structure, the characters are not discovering anything. They are functions rather than people. They react to the ball as it bounces between them, and those reactions are immediately discarded as the next cutaway takes over. When you have watched one of these episodes in its entirety, you often cannot recall what it was actually about 5 minutes after it ends. Individual gags may have been funny. The complete experience added up to nothing. Compare this to the worst Stan from American Dad's 7th season, which illustrates most clearly what the storytelling philosophy produces when fully engaged. Stan's goal in this episode is immediate and comprehensible. He wants to be the best man at his coworker Brian Lewis's wedding. This desire is entirely consistent with who Stan is, a man who craves recognition, who needs to feel chosen, who measures his worth in terms of being someone else's most important person. His CIA career is built on this same psychological architecture. The episode follows his increasingly elaborate and disastrously misguided attempts to secure this role through engineered situations rather than genuine connection, including a chicken wing bone lie and a staged choking rescue. Every single thing that goes wrong in this episode goes wrong because of specific, documented aspects of Stan's established personality. The comedy comes directly from these qualities and accumulates over the episode rather than resetting with each new beat. By the end, you are laughing at the full weight of who Stan is, not just at individual moments. American Dad also operates across a genuinely remarkable range of genres without losing its coherence. An episode might be a James Bond parody. The next might be psychological horror. The one after that might be a tightly structured domestic comedy with no supernatural elements. The show can move between these registers because the characters are stable and specific enough to anchor any genre. The genre is a lens for illuminating the characters, not a costume they wear temporarily. The episode Lost in Space from Season 8 devotes its entire runtime to Jeff Fisher, Haley's stoner husband, previously used mostly as amiable comic relief, and sends him into deep space after Roger inadvertently stows him aboard an alien vessel. The episode is a loving parody of low-budget science fiction adventure. But embedded in the genre comedy is a genuine story about Jeff realizing, through the experience of losing everything familiar, exactly how much his ordinary life means to him. He has to travel across a galaxy and face genuine danger to understand that getting back to Haley is not just convenient, it is the center of his life, and he had never fully understood that before losing access to it. Jeff, who the show had previously used mostly as a punchline, becomes a complete person in this episode. The moment he understands how desperately he wants to go home is genuinely touching within a comedy episode about a stoner navigating an alien shopping mall. That this works, that the feeling is real rather than performed, is the result of the show having built its world carefully enough and populated it with characters specific enough that even the secondary ones, given the right story, can carry this kind of weight. There is also the way American Dad handles its more purely experimental episodes, the ones where the format itself is being pushed in a direction beyond what the show normally does. The episode Rabbit Ears slides gradually from domestic comedy into something closer to psychological horror, as Stan becomes obsessed with a strange black and white broadcast from a garage sale television set. And the line between what he is watching and what he is living begins to blur in disturbing ways. It draws clear visual and thematic references to the Twilight Zone and uses those references not as parody material, but as genuine structural tools. It is interested in media consumption and obsession, and the way screens can replace genuine experience without the viewer quite noticing when the replacement happened. American Dad approaches this subject with real seriousness, and the episode works both as comedy and as something slightly more unsettling. Family Guy attempted its own genre experiments, most notably the Star Wars trilogy parody episodes, which were enormously popular. Those episodes work on their own terms as loving and precise parody. But the Griffins in those episodes are not really doing anything that connects to who they are as characters. You could replace them with any animated family, and the Star Wars episodes would work exactly the same way. In American Dad's Tearjerker, by contrast, the James Bond parody is built from the inside out from the established characters. Roger as the Bond villain, Stan as the hero, Francine as sex pun to come. Every casting choice is the correct one, illuminating something true about each character while also serving the genre requirements. The parody and the characterization are the same thing. This is a harder trick to pull off, and American Dad pulls it off with what appears to be ease. Family Guy produced episodes of comparable quality in its early seasons and in scattered moments across its revival. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, in which the two characters are locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the full episode talking to each other with no cutaway gags, is widely considered one of the finest episodes in the show's history. It is quiet, honest, emotionally ambitious, and completely unlike the standard Family Guy episode of its era. The tragedy of that episode in the context of the broader Family Guy story is that it is proof the show could always have been this. The restraint in it was always available. American Dad chose restraint as its foundational principle. Family Guy chose it once and produced something extraordinary, then returned to volume. Section 7. The Greatest Episodes, a tour through what American Dad built. There is a specific pleasure in watching a show attempt something genuinely ambitious and actually pull it off. The alignment of scope and execution producing an episode that exceeds what you expected from a regular installment. American Dad, more consistently than almost any adult animated comedy in the history of network television, produces this experience. Rapture's Delight received the highest critical grade of its broadcast night when it aired in December 2009, beating out new episodes of The Simpsons, The Cleveland Show, and Family Guy airing the same evening. The reviewer praised it for beginning in completely grounded territory and becoming progressively more surreal as it developed, earning its strangeness rather than simply asserting it. The wedding rings on the chain are funny because Stan, the most self-seriously masculine man in America, secretly wore both rings for 7 years of post-apocalyptic warfare. And they are devastating for exactly the same reason. The image is simultaneously absurd and true in a way that feels almost impossible to calculate in advance. You cannot plan that moment. You can only arrive at it by following a character honestly all the way to the end of his story. Tearjerker from Season 3 achieves something completely different but equally precise. Stan is sent on a mission against Roger, who has adopted the persona of a villainous movie producer, the tearjerker of the episode's title, whose scheme is to replace Hollywood's real actors with emotionless robots whose performances are so hollow that audiences cry themselves to death from the absence of genuine feeling. The episode is styled with total commitment to the James Bond aesthetic, right down to a full opening credits sequence. Francine as Bond girl sex pun to come, Steve as the young gadget expert, and Klaus pressed into service as the villain's most incompetent henchman. What elevates Tearjerker past mere parody is how perfectly the Bond villain archetype maps onto Roger's actual established personality. Roger's megalomania, his conviction that the world should orient itself around his needs, his theatrical sense of his own exceptionalism. These are real, documented aspects of who Roger is, and the Bond villain format gives them their ideal expression. You are laughing at the parody, and you are also laughing at Roger being most completely himself within the constraints of a genre designed for exactly this kind of personality. Great Space Roaster, from Season 5, demonstrates the show's ability to sustain a premise for 22 minutes without losing the comedy or the character precision. Roger asks the Smith family to roast him for his birthday. He wants to be savaged by the people who know him best. The Smiths agree and deliver genuinely pointed insults that land because they are specific and accurate. And Roger cannot handle it. His vanity cannot survive being seen clearly by people he lives with. He snaps. The episode becomes an alien parody as he hunts the family through their own home, which is both absurd and inevitable once you understand the specific shape of Roger's psychological fragility. The comedy is the comedy of watching a well-established character arrive, through entirely predictable logic, at an entirely unpredictable place. For Whom the Sleigh Bell Tolls, from Season 6, is perhaps the most purely fun episode the show produced. Stan and Steve accidentally shoot Santa Claus on Christmas Eve. Santa comes back from the dead, seeking violent revenge against the entire Smith family. Inside the absurdist premise, almost invisible until the final minutes, is a story about Stan accepting Jeff as a genuine member of his family, a person Stan has never managed to see as real or worthy of his protection. The moment in which Stan acknowledges Jeff is brief and quiet and completely earned, because the episode has spent its runtime proving that their instincts were the same when it actually mattered. No Weddings and a Funeral, from Season 16, is one of the most formally inventive things the show ever attempted. Klaus, the man in a fishbowl, the most overlooked member of the household, is pushed past his limit by the family's casual cruelty and leaves. The episode immediately jumps 15 years forward to reveal he has died. The rest of the episode explores what the Smiths look like without him. What the episode discovers and articulates with real precision is that Klaus's presence was structural, that the family's shared mild irritation with him was actually functioning as a bonding mechanism. Without Klaus to be collectively awful toward, the family fractures. The glue was the grievance. This is a genuinely sophisticated observation about how real families function, found in the show's most overlooked character and made into an episode that is both funny and, in its quieter moments, touching. The episode The Hand That Rocks the Rogue demonstrates something further. The show's ability to construct a formally nearly perfect comedy from a premise that should by rights be too absurd to take seriously. The joke about the red Havaianas, a callback that requires the audience to have been paying attention, that rewards that attention with a punchline that is funny specifically because of its specificity, is cited regularly by fans as an example of the show's joke construction at its finest. You cannot explain why It Was the Red Havaianas lands so well without describing the exact context that precedes it, because the context is what makes the specific detail hit. This is joke construction that only works when the audience knows the characters well enough to feel the weight of the particular. It is the comedy of accumulated knowledge rather than the comedy of immediate reaction. These episodes, and there are more, many more, scattered across 20-plus seasons, represent what American Dad can do when it is being fully itself. Not Family Guy's lesser sibling, something stranger and more patient and more emotionally honest. Something that takes the premise of an animated family comedy and asks what you can actually do with it if you commit to taking the people seriously. Section 8. The supporting cast. Why everyone in Langley Falls actually matters. One of the quieter but persistently important qualities of American Dad, especially in comparison to Family Guy, is the way the show treats everyone in its world. Not just the main family members, but every recurring character who populates Langley Falls. The show built an environment where the people around the Smiths feel like actual people with their own histories, their own dignity, and their own ongoing lives. Start with Francine Smith. In Family Guy, Lois Griffin begins as a grounded, patient, warm counterbalance to Peter's chaos, the adult in the room, the emotional anchor. As Peter flanderized into cruelty and the show stripped away its domestic warmth, Lois drifted with him. The warmth that made her compelling evaporated through accumulated neglect. By the later seasons, Lois exists mainly to react to Peter, gesturing toward the character she once was without actually being her. Francine Smith maintains her coherence and specificity throughout the run. She has her own history of recklessness and wildness, a past the show deploys in specific episodes to illuminate who she is in the present. She has her own self-deceptions, and her own genuine warmth, and her own moments of selfish behavior that are honest rather than glossed over. Her marriage to Stan feels like a real long partnership. Two people who genuinely chose each other and keep choosing each other, even while frustrating each other profoundly. Haley Smith deserves extended attention because she represents the show's political dimension at its most honest. The premise of the liberal activist daughter and the conservative CIA agent father could have been a one-note satirical setup, the same argument in different costumes every week, and in the first season, it occasionally was. But the show realized quickly that the Haley-Stan conflict was not really about politics. It was about a daughter who needs her father to see her as a person rather than a problem to be managed, and a father who is terrified of what it would mean to let go of his certainties long enough to actually see his child. The politics are the language they speak in a conversation that is really about love and recognition and fear of loss. The moments when Stan and Haley genuinely reach each other are moving precisely because the show has spent years establishing how difficult that connection is to achieve. Steve Smith is often underestimated as a character, and this feels like a real critical oversight. Steve has an emotional openness that is unusual for a male character in adult animated comedy. He feels things fully, expresses those feelings without embarrassment, and is loyal to his friendships in ways the show treats as genuine strengths. His friendship group with Snot, Barry, and Toshi is consistently funny. The episode Independent Movie, which follows Steve trying to help Snot process his estranged father's death through the making of a short film, is a piece of character-driven comedy that could not have been made without years of careful work establishing who Steve is and what his friendships mean to him. Klaus is the most significant example of a supporting character developed with unexpected depth. He was initially conceived as a talking pet figure roughly analogous to Brian Griffin, the animal with a dry, intelligent perspective on the family's behavior. But where Brian grew progressively more insufferable as Family Guy continued, Klaus grew progressively more interesting. Part of what makes Klaus work is the genuine tragedy of his situation, which the show does not always convert into comedy. He is a sentient person, a former Olympic athlete, a man who had an entire human life ahead of him, trapped in a goldfish body in a kitchen counter fishbowl, watching the family around him live the kind of life he can no longer have. When Stan apologizes to Klaus into Flippity Flop for what happened to him, plainly, without elaboration, just acknowledging that it was terrible and that he is sorry, the moment lands with a quiet honesty that is unusual and effective. No Weddings and a Funeral gives Klaus the most affecting treatment he receives in the entire run. The episode builds its entire premise around what the Smith family loses when Klaus leaves and then dies. The discovery that his presence was structural rather than peripheral, that their shared mild contempt for him was actually one of the invisible mechanisms holding the household together. Klaus mattered. The show told us honestly that he mattered. Compare all of this to how Family Guy handles Joe Swanson. Joe enters the show as the neighborhood's most respected figure, a police officer in a wheelchair who carries himself with quiet dignity and competence that makes Peter genuinely envious. Over the seasons, he becomes a primary target of casual cruelty. His disability converts from a character trait to a punchline. His confidence erodes. His marriage falls apart. His friends mock him. The character who was the anchor of quiet dignity in the early show becomes an illustration of how Family Guy treats its secondary characters as raw material for reaction with no obligation to the identity they once had. Langley Falls feels inhabited in a way that Quahog, Family Guy's setting, increasingly does not. The recurring supporting characters in American Dad accumulate history rather than losing it. Deputy Director Bullock, voiced by Patrick Stewart with a magnificent absurdist commitment, becomes funnier with every appearance because each one adds to a growing portrait of a specific and surprising person. The show's world rewards long-term viewership in ways that Family Guy's world largely stopped doing after the early revival seasons. Jeff Fisher deserves a specific mention here because his development across the series is one of the clearest examples of the show honoring a character who began as comic relief. Jeff was introduced as Haley's stoner boyfriend. Pleasant, good-natured, easy to overlook. He was a punchline. He existed to be the embodiment of everything Stan thought was wrong with his daughter's generation. What the show did with Jeff over time was quietly remarkable. Rather than keeping him as a one-note punchline, the writers discovered that Jeff's combination of qualities, his lack of ambition, his genuine warmth, his refusal to judge people harshly, his deep and uncomplicated love for Haley, made him interesting precisely because he was so different from everyone else in the show's world. Everyone in Langley Falls operates from some version of ambition or ego or self-protection. Jeff operates from something closer to pure acceptance. Lost in Space works as well as it does because the show had spent years establishing that Jeff's love for Haley was the organizing principle of his entire life, so that when that is removed, the episode has something genuinely real to work with. Section 9. 2 trajectories. Why one show got better while one got worse. There is a particular irony in the full story of these two shows that becomes more striking the further back you stand to see it. In 2005, when both Family Guy and American Dad were airing on Fox together on Sunday nights, the assumption shared by essentially everyone in the television world was clear and nearly universal. Family Guy was the show. American Dad was the show that aired after the show, the flagship and the footnote, the real thing and its lesser companion. Time has completely inverted that ranking, and the inversion did not happen through any single dramatic event. It happened through the slow, steady accumulation of choices. Creative choices, production choices, choices about what each show was trying to be and what it owed its audience. Those choices, made season by season across 20-plus years, produced two radically different trajectories that cannot now be mistaken for each other. Family Guy's trajectory is well documented. The first 3 seasons established something genuinely great. The revival in Season 4 was a strong return with early warning signs visible in retrospect. Seasons 4 and 5 were still strong. Seasons 6 and 7 were uneven, but produced memorable episodes. From Season 8 onward, the decline became impossible to deny, and the show's own self-aware meta-humor about its declining quality confirmed that the people making it knew something had changed, but could not or would not correct it. The ratings tell this story in cold numbers. Family Guy's debut pulled roughly 22 million viewers in 1999. The Season 4 return averaged around 7.9 million per episode. Season 13 was down to 5.86 million. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million. Season 23 had fallen to roughly 723,000. A loss of more than 90% of the audience from the revival peak. The show that once debuted to the largest audience any animated comedy had ever had was being watched by fewer people than live in many mid-sized American cities. The network's response to this decline was visible in scheduling decisions. Family Guy was moved from its 9 o'clock Sunday night slot to 9:30 in 2019. And then, for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, the show was moved from Sunday nights entirely to Wednesday nights, the first time it had aired on a weekday since its original troubled run before its first cancellation in 2002. The show that had defined Sunday animation domination for a decade was no longer considered a headliner. American Dad's trajectory went in a direction almost exactly opposite. The show spent its first season finding itself necessary and understandable, but producing competent rather than excellent television. The second and third seasons showed but real improvement. By seasons 4 and 5, the show was genuinely strong. And then, rather than plateauing or declining as most shows do after their initial creative peak, American Dad kept improving. The show's best creative work came in its later seasons, more structurally ambitious, more emotionally honest, more willing to experiment with format, more confident in the specific identity it had spent years building. When the show moved to TBS in 2014 for its 12th season, it continued producing strong work with, if anything, more creative freedom than it had enjoyed on broadcast television. It ranked as basic cable's top scripted comedy in its time slot among adults 18 to 34 for years. It kept experimenting, it kept investing in its characters. It kept finding new things to do with people it had now known for a decade. There is also the question of critical consensus as it has developed over the years, separate from the ratings story. In the early years of the revival, Family Guy was the show that generated cultural conversation. Reviews were active, fans debated individual episodes with genuine passion. Critics engaged with it as an object worthy of real analysis. That engagement has dimmed significantly as the later seasons accumulated. The critical conversation around Family Guy now is largely about its decline, about what it used to be and what it chose to become. American Dad's critical reputation has moved in the opposite direction. A show that critics initially dismissed became, over the course of the 2010s and 2020s, a show that serious viewers of adult animation pointed to as an example of how the format could be executed with genuine artistic commitment. The AV Club, which covered both shows consistently, moved from treating American Dad as the lesser McFarlane property to reviewing it as the more creatively vital and consistently surprising of the two. This shift represents the accumulated weight of episode after episode, demonstrating that the show had not just maintained its quality, but deepened it. In December 2025, Disney announced that American Dad had surpassed 1 billion hours streamed on Disney Plus in 2025, an extraordinary number for a show that has never had Family Guy's cultural footprint and has never been the subject of the same level of mainstream attention. 1 billion streaming hours is the result of people watching the show, completing it, recommending it to others, and then watching it again. It is the result of a show that rewards sustained and repeated viewing in ways that Family Guy's later seasons simply do not. In April 2025, after TBS declined to continue producing new episodes following the season 21 finale, American Dad returned to Fox for its 22nd season, premiering on February 22, 2026, as part of a 4-season pickup, renewed through at least season 25 and the 2028 to 2029 broadcast season. The show that had left Fox a decade earlier returned in a position of genuine creative and commercial strength. The footnote had become the flagship. Section 10, How Women Are Treated, a comparison that says everything. There is one dimension of the comparison between these two shows that deserves deliberate, specific attention, and that is how each show treats its female characters. The contrast is not subtle, and it speaks to something deep about the values embedded in each show's creative approach. The treatment of Meg Griffin in Family Guy is one of the most extensively documented cases of sustained character degradation in the history of network television. In the first 3 seasons, Meg was a sympathetic, if unremarkable character. The normal, unpopular teenager in an extraordinary household, relatable in ways the other Griffins were not. She wanted to be loved and accepted, which are among the most basic and universal human desires. She was imperfect and unexceptional, and that was entirely fine. Starting around season 4 and accelerating through seasons 8 to 14, the comedy about Meg shifted from her being boring to her being physically repulsive, unwanted, and deserving of active, escalating abuse from every member of her family and every corner of the world the show depicted. Peter physically harmed her for entertainment. Lois treated her with open coldness. Chris joined in on the insults. The entire town of Quahog seemed to have agreed collectively that Meg Griffin was subhuman. and the show presented this agreement as comedy, as the correct and funny way to perceive this character. Mila Kunis, the actress who voices Meg, has spoken publicly about the real-world consequences of this. People would approach her in public to recite the dismissive catchphrase Peter uses to shut Meg down, delivering it directly to the real woman as though cruelty were a form of greeting. The fictional abuse had escaped into the world. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the show's most revealing moment on this subject. Meg stands up to her family, names what has been done to her, describes it accurately and without exaggeration. And then the episode concludes with Meg voluntarily returning to her role as the family's punching bag, because without her serving that function, the family structure collapses. The show used a moment of genuine reckoning to argue that the victim's acceptance of their abuse was necessary and perhaps even noble. Whatever the writers intended, what the episode communicated was structural. Meg's suffering has a purpose in this show, and therefore it must continue. American Dad never produced anything like this. Haley Smith disagrees with her father constantly, sometimes brilliantly, and the show treats her perspective as worthy of genuine consideration. Francine has flaws and blind spots, but is never the target of the kind of sustained, gleeful humiliation that Meg endures. When male characters in American Dad mistreat female characters, it tends to be something the show examines and subjects to consequence, rather than something it presents as entertainment in itself. The shift in how American Dad treats its female characters has been partly attributed to the deliberate inclusion of more women in the writing staff over the show's middle and later seasons. But it is also a reflection of the show's fundamental creative philosophy, that the characters in its world are people with interior lives and dignity, and that comedy built on denying someone's humanity tends to curdle over time into something that does not feel like comedy at all. There is a broader point here about comedy that punches down versus comedy that punches sideways or upward. Punching down, finding the comedy and making the least powerful character in a scene the target, is easy. It requires no creativity. The target cannot effectively fight back, which means the joke has no resistance and generates no real energy beyond the initial impact. American Dad prefers comedy that generates energy from conflict between equals, or from power meeting its own unexpected limits, or from intelligence applied to absurd situations. Even when the show goes to dark places, and it does regularly, the darkness tends to be the kind that reveals something, rather than the kind that simply demeans. The contrast in how the two shows depict their central marriages adds another layer. Stan and Francine's marriage has the texture and specific complications of a real long partnership. They genuinely chose each other. They keep choosing each other through frustration and disagreement and occasional genuine crisis. Their arguments are about real things. Their moments of warmth are earned rather than performed. Rapture's delight is the supreme expression of this, but the evidence runs through hundreds of smaller moments across the full run. Peter and Lois's marriage, in the show's later seasons, cannot support that kind of weight. The show has accumulated too many instances of Peter's contempt and casual cruelty for the premise of their relationship as a love story to remain tenable. The periodic attempts to reset back to a version of the marriage where they seem to want to be together feel false against the accumulated evidence. Once you have spent years watching someone be treated the way Peter treats Lois, the gestures toward affection stop being moving and start being uncomfortable. American Dad kept earning those gestures. Family Guy stopped earning them a long time ago. Section 11. Why the jokes in American Dad work differently. Let us be specific about how American Dad generates its humor, because in the end, a comedy lives or dies based on whether it is actually funny. And the question of how American Dad's comedy engine works deserves to be examined in terms that go beyond it has good characters. The humor in American Dad operates in reinforcing layers rather than competing modes. The broadest layer is Roger's absurdist comedy, the sheer volume and variety of insane things Roger does and says, the persona gags, the physical comedy of an alien navigating human social norms with complete contempt for those norms while simultaneously being desperate to participate in them. This layer is immediately accessible to anyone watching. You do not need prior knowledge of the show to laugh at Roger in almost any episode. Below that is the satirical layer, The ongoing examination of American culture and masculine identity through a CIA agent who applies the certainties of his professional life to every corner of his domestic existence. Stan's patriotism is funny, partly because it is exaggerated to the point of self-parody, and partly because the show understands the psychological need it serves. The need to believe your country is definitively good, your choices definitively correct, your certainties a strength rather than a limitation. The comedy comes from watching that certainty meet a world that continuously refuses to organize itself around it. The show is political without being preachy, and this distinction matters. When Brian Griffin in later Family Guy delivers a political speech, you are aware that you are watching the writers using a character as a direct mouthpiece. The character disappears and the opinion takes his place. When Stan Smith espouses an extreme political position, you are watching a specific, complicated person expressing something that grows from his history and his psychology. Something the show then subjects to consequence. A character who has political views is fundamentally different from a character who exists to deliver political views, and the difference is the difference between drama and lecture. At the deepest and most satisfying level is the comedy of accumulated recognition. The humor that comes from watching specific psychological patterns play out to their completely predictable but still surprising conclusions. The joke that is funniest because you know exactly who this person is and therefore exactly how they are going to be wrong about this particular situation is funnier than any random gag. It is the humor of accumulation, and it only works if the show has done the patient, unglamorous work of establishing the character precisely enough that the audience can predict the pattern while still being surprised by the specific form it takes. American Dad has done that work systematically across 20 seasons. Every major character has an established psychology specific enough to generate comedy directly from who they are. This means watching more of the show makes every individual joke land harder, because the context for understanding exactly why this particular failure was inevitable for this particular person keeps deepening. Later, Family Guy does not work this way. Episodes are interchangeable. Characters are flatter versions of what they once were. Watching more of the later seasons does not deepen your appreciation of individual jokes, because there is nothing accumulating. No growing portrait of a specific person being funny in specifically their own way. There is also the way American Dad handles its running gags, which is instructive in comparison to how Family Guy handles the same structural device. Family Guy's running gags in its later seasons tend to calcify. The Peter and the Giant Chicken fight sequences, genuinely creative in their original appearances, became extended set pieces deployed when the show needed spectacle. The Conway Twitty gag became a symbol of creative bankruptcy. The Quagmire catchphrases, the Meg abuse beat, the cutaway structure itself, all went from being features of the show to being repetitive patterns the show fell back on rather than actively chose. American Dad's running gags evolve. The Wheels and the Legman detective partnership between Steve and Roger started as a single episode concept and accumulated across many episodes into a recurring bit that gets funnier with each iteration because each iteration adds something. New detail, new stakes, new absurdity layered on top of established absurdity. The Golden Turd Saga, which ran as a background joke across many seasons, paid off in the 200th episode with a resolution that worked specifically because it had been building for so long. Running gags in American Dad are investments with compounding returns, not habits on autopilot. The physical comedy in American Dad also has a quality worth naming. The show does not shy away from slapstick. Stan's overconfident entry into physical situations he is wholly unprepared for is a reliable comedic resource across the entire run. But physical comedy in American Dad is always integrated with character comedy rather than replacing it. When Stan crashes into something, the funny part is not just the crash. It is the specific, documented, thoroughly established way this particular man interprets and responds to what just happened. The way his self-image reorganizes instantly around the event to protect him from acknowledging its true meaning. The fall is the setup. The reorganization is the joke. Family Guy's later physical comedy increasingly relies on graphic, detailed injury for its own sake. depicted with a level of anatomical specificity that crosses the comfortable boundary between cartoon slapstick and something that reads as genuinely unpleasant. This is the shock value problem in miniature. The attempt to generate a reaction through intensity rather than through craft, through the specificity of depicted suffering rather than through the comedy of a specific person being specifically ridiculous in a specifically their way. It generates reactions. It does not generate affection. Section 12. The legacy question. The final reckoning and what it all means. There is a version of this conversation that ends with Family Guy being remembered as the more important show, and that version has genuine foundation. Family Guy changed things. It demonstrated that an animated comedy could survive cancellation through audience loyalty alone, a proof of concept that influenced how networks think about fan engagement ever since. It pioneered a comedic format that shaped an enormous number of shows and content creators who came after it. During its peak years, it was as culturally present as any animated comedy had been since the early years of The Simpsons. The Emmy nomination in 2009 for Outstanding Comedy Series was genuinely historic, the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly 5 decades earlier. The DVD sales during the cancellation years were unprecedented for a canceled cartoon. These are real achievements, earned by real quality, and they belong permanently to the record. But here's what history will also see. A show that had everything it needed to be great for as long as it ran, and that chose, season by season, to trade those things away for something louder and cheaper. A show whose ratings fell from 22 million at launch to roughly 700,000 by its 23rd season, a decline of more than 95%. A show moved from its Sunday night home to Wednesday nights because the network no longer considered it a headliner. A show that kept going not because the creative passion driving it was still real, but because it was too profitable to stop. That is not the story of a show that simply aged. Every show ages. That is the story of a show that made specific, avoidable choices that accelerated and deepened a decline that did not have to be as severe as it became. American Dad's legacy is still accumulating because the show is still producing strong work. But its shape is already visible. The story of a show that was underestimated from its first episode, and that responded to that underestimation not by chasing what already existed, but by developing into something entirely its own. A show that got genuinely better as it aged. A show that produced its most ambitious and emotionally honest work in seasons that came a decade and more after its premiere. A show that built characters who remained worth caring about across 20-plus seasons because the people making it never stopped caring about them. The billion streaming hours on Disney Plus in 2025 are the quiet vindication of everything American Dad was patient enough to build. They represent an audience that found the show, watched it all the way through, and then watched it again by its side. Because it rewards that kind of sustained attention in ways that the show's more famous sibling stopped doing years ago. People do not binge a show because it generates good reactions. They binge a show because they want more time with the people in it. They invest in the ongoing lives of the characters. American Dad creates this investment. Family Guy in its later seasons does not. The thing that gets said least often about American Dad, partly because it is the hardest thing to articulate, is that the show is genuinely kind toward its characters in a way that Family Guy gradually stopped being. Not soft. American Dad is frequently brutal in its comedy, frequently dark in its subject matter, frequently willing to go places that require the audience to hold discomfort alongside laughter. But kind in the sense of taking the characters seriously as people whose experiences matter, whose pain is real even when it is being mined for comedy, whose small victories deserve to be honored and their losses acknowledged honestly. Peter Griffin in his later years does not have the experience of being taken seriously by his show. He is a mechanism for reactions, a delivery system for outrage and shock. Whatever dignity he once had was systematically stripped away, not because the story required it, but because the show decided long ago that his dignity was less useful than his extremity. Stan Smith, even at his most ridiculous, even at his most wrong, is always taken seriously as a person by the show that created him. His failures are real failures. His love for his family is real love. His struggle to be better than his limitations allow him to be is a real struggle, treated with the honesty it deserves. This kindness, this underlying respect for the humanity of the character, even within a wildly absurd comedy, is what gives American Dad the ability to produce episodes that genuinely move people alongside episodes that are purely and riotously funny. It is what makes Rapture's Delight work as both comedy and something close to tragedy simultaneously. It is what makes the smaller moments, Stan carrying Steve to the slip and slide, the wedding rings on the chain, the word baby girl, land with the weight they carry. You can only feel those moments if the show has been honest about the person feeling them. American Dad has always been honest. That honesty is the foundation of everything else it built. One final thing worth saying because it often goes unsaid. The fact that American Dad got better over time while maintaining consistent quality is genuinely rare. Television shows almost universally decline. Most long-running comedies follow the same arc: explosive initial success, creative peak somewhere in the first 5 to 7 seasons, and then gradual erosion as the original energy dissipates and the writers are producing harder for diminishing returns. American Dad is an exception to this pattern. Not because it is immune to the pressures that cause decline, it faced every one of them, but because the creative decisions made in response to those pressures consistently prioritized quality over convenience. When the show faced the challenge of sustaining 22 episodes a season after many years, it responded by taking greater structural risks rather than falling back on reliable formulas. When the obvious jokes about the characters had been made, it went looking for the less obvious ones. When the supporting cast had served their initial narrative functions, it invested in finding new things to do with them rather than cycling through the same limited sketches. American Dad is still worth watching in its current seasons. That is not something you can say about every show that has been on television for 20-plus years. It is not something you can say about Family Guy. That difference, maintained consistently across decades of production, is the legacy. It is the argument. It is the answer to the question in the title of tonight's video. American Dad is better because it cared, persistently, consistently, across every season and every creative challenge, about the things that make television genuinely worth watching over time. The characters, the stories, the slow, patient accumulation of moments that add up to something larger than any individual episode, the trust in its audience to follow it into strange and sometimes genuinely moving territory, the willingness to be honest about its people rather than simply using them. Caring about those things does not guarantee greatness. There are plenty of shows that care and still fail to achieve it. But without them, greatness is impossible. And with them, sustained across 20 seasons of an adult animated comedy about a CIA agent and an alien and a German man living in a fishbowl, with them, something genuinely extraordinary can grow. Even there. All right, if you have made it this far tonight, genuinely, thank you for spending the time. These are two shows I think about a lot, not just as entertainment, but as a long case study in what separates creative vitality from creative exhaustion. American Dad built its reputation slowly and without fanfare, and it deserves far more credit than it typically receives in the broader conversation about the history of adult animation. If you enjoyed tonight's video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. It keeps this channel going and means you will see what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite American Dad episode. Or tell me you want to argue the case for Family Guy's later seasons, or just tell me where you are in the world right now. I read every comment, and they genuinely shape what this channel does next. Wherever you are tonight, whatever brought you here, I hope the rest of it is quiet and restful. Until next time. Script written for Uncle Guy Lore, https://www.youtube.com/@UncleGuyLore. Optimized for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Supplementary analysis. Section by section deeper dives. On the cutaway problem, additional context. There is something worth examining specifically about how the two shows handle the experience of time within their episodes. When Family Guy relies on cutaways to fill its runtime, the episodes develop a very particular rhythm: burst of story, escape to cutaway, return to story, escape again. That prevents any scene from developing momentum. Comedy benefits enormously from momentum. A running joke gets funnier as it builds. A dramatic situation gets more tense as it develops. A character's emotional state becomes more interesting as you watch it accumulate across a scene rather than being punctured every 30 seconds by something completely unrelated. Cutaways interrupt all of this before it can build into anything meaningful. Every escape to a random gag resets the emotional clock back to zero and forces the audience to re-engage with the premise from scratch. American Dad, without this escape available, is forced to let its scenes develop at their natural pace. The comedy has room to compound. The characters have room to react to each other, rather than simply triggering each other's setups and immediately departing from the scene. This structural difference becomes especially visible when you compare how jokes land in each show. In a well-constructed American Dad episode, a joke in the third act is funnier than an equivalent joke in the first act because the setup has been accumulating for 20 minutes. You understand the character deeply enough by that point that the joke hits harder. The comedy of recognition amplifying the comedy of the moment. In a cutaway-heavy Family Guy episode, every joke starts at the same baseline because the connections between scenes are too weak to accumulate anything. You are always laughing at the immediate surface of the gag rather than at the depth behind it. The show's own awareness of this problem and its inability to actually fix it became one of the more poignant features of its later years. The writers knew the cutaway dependency was a weakness. They made jokes about it. They wrote meta-episodes examining it. They produced one genuinely brilliant episode, Brian and Stewie, that demonstrated what the show was capable of when it abandoned cutaways entirely, and then they went right back to producing cutaway-heavy episodes the following week. The knowledge of the problem and the will to solve it were never in the same room at the same time. American Dad never had this problem because it never had the option. Constraint, in this case, was the gift. On Peter Griffin and Stan Smith, additional comparison. The contrast between Peter Griffin and Stan Smith becomes even more stark when you examine specific episodes from comparable periods of each show's run. Take a middle-era Family Guy episode from around season 10 or 11, and take a middle-era American Dad episode from the same period. Not the best episodes of each, the average representative episodes that fill most of any season. In the Family Guy episode, Peter will almost certainly do something harmful to someone he is supposed to love. He will face no real consequence. The episode will not acknowledge that what he did was harmful, except possibly as the setup for another joke. By the end of the episode, the status quo will have reset completely, and Peter will not have been changed or deepened, or even slightly altered by whatever he experienced. In the American Dad episode, Stan will almost certainly do something harmful to someone he is supposed to love. But the episode will examine the harm. It will follow the consequence. It will give the person he harmed a genuine response to what happened. And by the end of the episode, something small but real will have shifted. Either in Stan's understanding of himself, or in his relationship with the person he wronged, or at minimum in the specific situation that the episode built and resolved. The status quo will roughly reassert itself, as it does in all episodic comedy, but it will do so after having genuinely visited somewhere worth visiting. This difference in how each show handles the aftermath of a character's bad behavior tells you everything about what each show is actually interested in. Family Guy, in its later years, is interested in the behavior. The bad thing Peter does is the content. American Dad is interested in the relationship. The bad thing Stan does is the catalyst for something the show actually wants to explore. It is worth noting that both shows have the same basic mandate: make people laugh for 22 minutes a week, 52 weeks a year, for as long as Fox will renew them. Both shows face the same pressure to produce acceptable material on a punishing schedule. Both shows have access to the same range of tools and approaches. The difference between them is purely a question of what each show decided to value. That is a creative choice, made deliberately, and the results of that choice are now visible across 2 decades of output. On Roger the Alien, additional character analysis. Roger's persona system also reveals something interesting about what American Dad understands that Family Guy lost: the importance of consequence within comedy. When Roger adopts a persona and the persona does something terrible, the consequences of that terrible thing follow Roger back to the Smith household. The persona system does not function as a get-out-of-consequence-free card. It functions as an amplification of Roger's existing character, and the amplification produces real effects on real people that the show then has to deal with. This is why Roger, despite being objectively one of the most morally reprehensible characters in adult animation, remains sympathetic across 20 seasons in a way that later Brian Griffin or later Peter Griffin do not. Roger's cruelty and selfishness always cost him something. The Smiths always hold him accountable in ways proportionate to what he has done, even if their patience with him is extraordinary and their tolerance for his behavior is far greater than any reasonable person's tolerance would be. The accounting is always there. The ledger is always maintained. Peter Griffin's behavior in the later seasons costs him essentially nothing. The world around him absorbs his cruelty without complaint. His wife forgives him without requiring genuine change. His children suffer without the suffering being acknowledged as real damage. This is not the structure of comedy. It is the structure of something more like wish fulfillment, a fantasy in which a man can do whatever he wants to the people around him and face no meaningful consequences. That fantasy is not interesting to watch for 22 minutes, and it is not interesting to watch across 20 seasons. Roger, by contrast, lives in a world where his choices produce outcomes, where the people around him push back, adjust, sometimes forgive, and sometimes don't, and where the relationships shift and develop as a result of what has happened between the people in them. This is why his friendship with Stan, his relationship with Francine, his complicated dynamic with Steve, all of these feel alive across the run of the show. They are alive because they have been affected by what the characters have done to each other, and those effects have been honestly tracked. On the greatest episodes, additional episode analysis, there are several American Dad episodes that did not fit neatly into the earlier discussion but that deserve attention as examples of the show at its most ambitious and most rewarding. The episode Independent Movie from Season 9 is a masterclass in using genre parody to explore genuine emotion. Steve enlists his friend group to make a short film as a way of helping Snot process the death of his estranged father, a man who was absent from Snot's life for years, but whose death nonetheless opens wounds that Snot does not know how to access directly. The episode parodies the conventions of independent cinema with precision and genuine affection for the genre being lampooned. But it also tells a real story about grief and the way teenagers navigate loss through the tools available to them: creativity, friendship, the shared project that gives everyone something to do with feelings they cannot quite articulate. The scene in which Snot finally breaks down is played completely straight. There is no joke. The comedy pauses to let the feeling happen, and then the comedy resumes. This is a tonal choice that requires confidence. The confidence that the audience will accept genuine emotion inside a comedy episode without feeling that the comedy has been betrayed or that the emotion is unearned. American Dad has this confidence because it has built the relationship between its characters and its audience carefully enough that genuine emotion always has a foundation to stand on. The episode May the Best, Stan Wynn from Season 5 takes an entirely different approach, a Terminator parody in which a robot version of Stan arrives from the future to compete with present-day Stan for Francine's affections on Valentine's Day. The episode uses the science fiction premise to examine something true about Stan's relationship with Francine. His fear that she would prefer a version of him that was better in the ways he is worst, that did not have his limitations and blind spots and stubborn refusal to change. The robot Stan is everything present-day Stan is not: attentive, perceptive, expressive, willing to admit weakness. And Francine is genuinely drawn to him. This is not played as a simple reassurance that Stan is fine as he is. It is played as a genuine examination of why Francine stays with Stan despite his faults. What she actually loves in him that the perfect robot version does not have. The episode earns its happy ending rather than assuming it. These are the kinds of episodes that American Dad keeps producing, in season after season that Family Guy's later years essentially stopped attempting. Episodes that use the show's absurd premise not just as a generator of jokes, but as a lens through which to examine something true about the people at the center of it. On the supporting cast, additional notes. The CIA as a setting gives American Dad a supporting cast infrastructure that Family Guy's bar and neighborhood world simply cannot match. Stan's co-workers are not just background figures who occasionally walk through the frame. They are recurring characters with established relationships to Stan and to each other, with their own histories and their own comic logic. Deputy Director Avery Bullock, played by Patrick Stewart with magnificent absurdist commitment, is the most visible example. Stewart's voice performance gives Bullock a quality of imperious authority that makes every scene he appears in funnier than the equivalent scene would be with any other voice doing the same lines. But Bullock is also more than a voice joke. He is a character with an established internal life, a recurring set of obsessions and vulnerabilities and contradictions that the show has developed over many seasons. His relationship to his own power is complicated in ways that generate comedy. His relationship to the agents under his command is controlling and occasionally genuinely affectionate, which makes every interaction between him and Stan a small drama with stakes beyond the immediate scene. This is how supporting casts work in shows that care about them. Every recurring character is an investment. The first few appearances of a new character are paying in, establishing who they are, what they want, how they relate to the main cast. Every subsequent appearance pays out compound interest on that initial investment, because the audience's accumulated knowledge of the character makes every new scene with them more efficient and more funny. You do not have to re-establish who Bullock is every time he appears. You can start from everything you already know and go somewhere new immediately. Family Guy's recurring supporting characters stopped accumulating this kind of interest long ago. Quagmire is still Quagmire, doing the same things he has always done. Cleveland left for a spin-off and came back diminished. Joe Swanson's disability became a punchline rather than a character trait. The supporting cast that was once full of specific, interesting people became a collection of types without depth, deployed for the same reactions they had always generated, producing progressively smaller returns as the audience grew tired of being asked to laugh at the same things for the 20th and 30th time. On legacy and conclusion, additional thoughts. The question of which show will ultimately be remembered more fondly by history is genuinely interesting, partly because the answer depends on which time frame you use and which audience you are asking. Family Guy will be remembered for its early seasons with genuine warmth and genuine critical respect. The show that those seasons represent, fast, inventive, warm underneath the irreverence, structurally grounded, while formally adventurous, was one of the finest adult animated comedies ever produced. The people who discovered the show in those years and fell in love with it carry a real and justified attachment. That attachment is why the show survived 2 cancellations. That attachment is why the brand has remained viable for 25 years, even as the quality declined. You cannot manufacture that kind of love from nothing. The early Family Guy earned it honestly. American Dad will be remembered as the show that took the tools Seth MacFarlane developed and used them more carefully, more patiently, more consistently than their original application. It will be remembered as the show that got better rather than worse, that kept finding things to say about its characters when the obvious things had been said, that produced some of the finest individual episodes in the history of adult animation in its 15th and 16th and 17th seasons. It will be remembered as the quiet achiever, the show that everyone kept sleeping on while it kept doing extraordinary work in the background of the cultural conversation about adult animation. The billion streaming hours tell you which show people are actually choosing to watch with their time when they have the full catalog available and no obligation to choose one over the other. People choose American Dad because it is still good. They choose Family Guy because they remember when it was good. Those are very different things, and the difference between them is the whole of the argument. On Stan and His Family, a deeper look at what American Dad gets right. There is a recurring argument about why viewers stay with certain shows long past the point where the novelty has worn off. The argument tends to reduce to a simple question. Do you care about the people? Not whether you find them amusing on a moment-to-moment basis, whether you genuinely care what happens to them, whether you would feel something if the show were taken away, whether the characters have accumulated enough specific reality in your imagination that they feel like people you actually know rather than constructions you have been entertained by. American Dad, across its run, passes this test for its main characters in ways that speak to the quality of the writing and the care of the production. Stan Smith feels like someone you know, not someone you would want as a neighbor or a father-in-law or a coworker. He would be exhausting and occasionally terrible in any of those roles. But someone whose specific shape of difficulty you understand, whose weaknesses and strengths you can predict, whose bad decisions make a kind of painful sense given everything you know about who he is and where he came from. The episode that captures this most clearly, outside of Rapture's delight, might be Tears of a Clooney, an early episode in which Stan tries to set up Francine with George Clooney because he believes she is secretly in love with Clooney and wants her to be happy, even at the cost of their marriage. The episode is partly a parody of Clooney's charming rogue public image and partly a very specific story about a man who loves his wife so much that his greatest fear is not losing her to someone else but failing to give her what she actually deserves. The joke is that Stan has completely misread the situation. Francine is not in love with Clooney, she loves Stan. But the misreading comes from a place of such genuine devotion that the joke generates warmth rather than contempt. Compare this to any comparably structured Family Guy episode in which Peter believes Lois is interested in someone else. The Family Guy version of this story, if it existed, would most likely involve Peter doing something horrible to eliminate the competition. The American Dad version involves Stan doing something genuinely self-sacrificing out of love, and getting the love story right, even while being completely wrong about the immediate situation. The difference is the whole of the difference between the two shows in miniature. Francine's relationship with Stan generates its own recurring comedy through the specific nature of their dynamic. Stan needs to be right. Francine needs to be seen. These are compatible needs some of the time and incompatible needs much of the time, and the comedy of their marriage comes from the specific ways those needs collide in specific situations. The episode 4 Little Words, in which Stan frames Francine as a murderer specifically to avoid hearing her say, "I told you so," is hilarious precisely because it is both absurd in its execution and completely psychologically accurate in its premise. This is the exact thing that Stan Smith specifically would do. Not any cartoon husband. This one. The show also finds richness in Francine's own specific psychology. In Stan's food restaurant, a flashback reveals that Stan met Francine while she was hitchhiking. He accidentally ran over a raccoon, shot it to end its suffering, and Francine found this the most compassionate act she had ever seen. They got married the same year. This origin story is both funny and, when you sit with it, oddly moving. Two people who found each other through a complete accident that revealed something true about each of them. It tells you something specific about who Francine is and why she and Stan work together despite everything. Steve Smith's development across the series deserves more attention than it usually receives. In the show's early seasons, Steve is primarily the awkward nerd whose social failures generate comedy. He desperately wants to be cool, consistently fails to achieve it, and his earnestness in the face of repeated rejection is the joke. But across 20 seasons, the show found something more interesting in Steve than the perpetual loser. It found a person with a specific kind of decency and warmth that the more obviously cool characters around him lack. Steve is loyal. Steve cares about his friendships in a way that goes beyond strategic social positioning. Steve, when people he loves are in trouble, shows up. The episode Tearjerker, which we have already discussed as a genre parody triumph, also works as a Steve episode because it uses the spy format to let Steve be the competent gadget expert he has always wanted to be in a world where his specific skills matter. The episode gives Steve a version of the adventure he has always wanted, and the joy in the voice performance makes the genre comedy richer and warmer than pure parody would be. Even Haley, who spends much of the series in opposition to Stan, and therefore in a position of defining herself primarily by what she is against, gets episodes that explore who she is beyond the activist daughter role. Her marriage to Jeff, which Stan resists for years, eventually produces some of the show's most genuine warmth. The slow, grudging recognition from Stan that Jeff loves Haley in a real and specific way, and that this love is worth more than any of the qualities Stan would have chosen for her in a hypothetical son-in-law. The episode in which Stan finally acknowledges Jeff as family is genuinely touching, not because it is dramatically elaborate, but because it has been built toward across so many seasons of Stan's resistance. The thing that finally changes Stan's mind is not an argument or a dramatic event, but a simple demonstration of Jeff's love for Haley in a moment of genuine crisis. And Stan's recognition of it feels real because we have watched him be wrong about Jeff for years. This is what sustained, patient, committed storytelling produces. Not fireworks, not viral moments, character. Accumulated, specific, unmistakable character that makes every scene richer because of everything that has come before it. A final word on comedy and time. There is one thing about American Dad that is almost never discussed in conversations about why it is good, and that is the specific way its comedy ages. Not how well it holds up, though it does hold up, generally better than Family Guy's later cutaway-dependent episodes, but how the comedy interacts with time in a way that most television comedy does not. Most comedy is consumed once and then set aside. You watch it, you laugh, you move on. The jokes are complete in themselves. There is nothing additional to find on a second viewing. This is fine. This is how most comedy works and how it is supposed to work. American Dad, particularly in its best episodes, rewards rewatching in the specific way that dramatic television rewards rewatching. Because your knowledge of what is coming changes your perception of what you are seeing in the earlier parts of the episode, and your knowledge of the characters changes your understanding of why they do what they do at every moment. When you watch Rapture's delight knowing the ending, the Stan of the first act looks different. His impatience with Francine in the church, his preoccupation with his own spiritual status over his wife's emotional state, these read differently when you know what 7 years of absence from her will cost him. The comedy is still there, but it is deepened by the knowledge of what it is going to mean. This is the quality of storytelling that distinguishes art that lasts from entertainment that is consumed and forgotten. Not every episode of American Dad achieves it. Many episodes are simply funny, which is enough and which is what the show is primarily trying to be. But enough episodes achieve something more that the show as a whole is elevated by their presence, lifted into a category of television that rewards the investment of real attention over a long period of time. That is rare. In adult animated comedy, it may be unique. American Dad earned it by making good choices, consistently, across 20 seasons of Saturday night production pressure and network renewal negotiations, and the constant temptation to take the easier path. The show made good choices and kept making them. And the result is something that will outlast the moment of its making by many years, something that new audiences will discover on streaming platforms for decades to come and find, to their genuine surprise and pleasure, that it is still as good as anyone who loved it always said it was. That is the final answer to the question this video asked. That is why American Dad is better than Family Guy. Not because Family Guy was never good, but because American Dad stayed good. It kept caring, and caring, sustained, and specific and honest across 20 years made all the difference. The writing room philosophy. What sustained each show? There is a question underneath all the more visible comparisons we have been making tonight, and it is a question about production culture, about what it actually means to run a creative operation responsibly over many years. Both Family Guy and American Dad are the products of large teams of writers, directors, animators, voice performers, and production staff working on incredibly tight schedules. 22 episodes a season is an enormous creative output by any standard. The pressure to fill that schedule with acceptable material every year is constant and genuinely difficult to manage well over the long term. The temptation to reach for reliable formulas when the more ambitious approach would require more time and more risk is understandable, even inevitable in a system that rewards meeting the deadline over exceeding the expectation. What separates the two shows over time at the production culture level is how each writing room responded to that pressure. Family Guy's response, broadly visible in the output across its later seasons, was to lean on what had already proven it worked, to lean on cutaways because they filled time efficiently, To lean on shock value because it generated reactions without requiring the setup of genuine comedy? To lean on established character patterns even when those patterns had calcified past the point of honest storytelling? The path of least resistance, chosen repeatedly, produces a path that only leads downhill. American Dad's response, equally visible in the output across its comparable later seasons, was to keep asking the harder question: what is the most interesting thing we can do with these specific people in this specific situation? Not the most reliable thing, not the most efficient thing, the most interesting thing. This question produces more failures than the reliable question produces. Episodes that did not quite work, experiments that misfired, formal risks that did not pay off the way they were intended to. But it also produces the episodes that make people become genuine fans rather than habitual viewers. It produces the episodes that people recommend to friends and family who have never seen the show. It produces the kind of television that you actually miss when it is gone. The writers who took over American Dad from MacFarlane, as his other projects consumed more of his attention, primarily Matt Weitzman and later Brian Boyle, appear to have genuinely understood what the show was built on and valued it enough to protect it. They did not try to make it more like Family Guy. They did not try to make it louder or more extreme or more dependent on the shock value that was becoming Family Guy's primary creative currency in those same years. They made it more itself, more patient, more specific, more willing to spend an entire episode with a character the audience had previously considered a background fixture, more committed to earning the emotional moments rather than simply inserting them. This kind of stewardship is rarer than it should be. Most shows, when the founding creative vision steps back, drift toward the mean. They become more generic, more dependent on formula, more interested in not failing than in succeeding. American Dad avoided this drift. It used MacFarlane's decreased day-to-day involvement not as an occasion for creative coasting, but as an opportunity to discover what the show could be when its most distinctive qualities were fully developed and trusted. The result was a show that found its fullest expression not in its first years, but in its second decade. A genuinely unusual achievement that the history of television does not offer many precedents for. That this happened in the context of an adult animated comedy about a CIA agent and a talking alien and a man who lives in a fishbowl makes it, if anything, more remarkable. High art with humble materials. Great storytelling in an unpretentious format. Comedy that cares about its people in a genre that sometimes forgets people are the point. American Dad remembered. That is, in the end, the whole of it. Why audiences keep coming back. The investment that compounds. One more thing worth saying before we close tonight, because it connects everything we have discussed to the question of why any of this matters to an audience member sitting at home watching a cartoon. Television viewing is a form of relationship. You spend time with these characters. You invite them into your evenings and your weekends and your late nights when you cannot sleep. You develop opinions about them, preferences and loyalties, and specific kinds of frustration that are only possible when you care enough about someone for their behavior to actually affect you. The characters become familiar in the way that people you spend regular time with become familiar, not through any single dramatic encounter, but through the accumulation of small, consistent moments that slowly build a portrait specific enough to feel real. American Dad earns this kind of relationship with its audience. It earns it slowly, over many seasons, through the consistent attention it pays to its characters and the consistent honesty with which it portrays them. By the time you have watched 10 or 12 seasons of Stan Smith being impossible and occasionally wonderful, the character has become genuinely real to you in the way that fictional people become real, when they are made with enough care and consistency. You know how he thinks, you know what he wants, you know exactly how he is going to react to the next absurd situation the show places him in, and you are right about it, and being right about it is part of the comedy and part of the pleasure. Family Guy gave its audience this relationship in its early seasons, and then gradually withdrew it. The characters became less predictable not because they had grown and changed, but because the writers were no longer asking what these specific people would do in this situation. They were asking what would generate the strongest reaction, and plugging the closest available character into that reaction. The investment the audience had made in the early seasons was borrowed against rather than honored. And like any relationship where the trust is repeatedly drawn down without being replenished, the relationship eventually ran dry for many viewers. There is a reason the American Dad subreddit is full of genuine enthusiasm about new episodes, of people recommending specific mid-run episodes to newcomers, of fans who have watched the show 3 or 4 times through and still find things to discuss and appreciate. There is a reason the Family Guy subreddit is, more often than not, a place where people mourn what the show used to be and occasionally note with something close to relief when a newer episode is almost as good as the good old days. These are not random cultural outcomes. They are the direct results of the specific choices each show made about what it was for and what it owed the people who watched it. American Dad decided it was for the long game, for the investment that compounds, for the kind of relationship with an audience that gets richer rather than poorer with time. That decision, made and remade season after season, is why the show has 1 billion streaming hours and still enthusiastic fans in its 22nd season. It is why this video exists. It is why the argument this video makes is not really a hard argument to make at all, if you have been paying attention. American Dad is better than Family Guy because it made better choices, consistently, for longer. That is not a complicated truth, but it is a true one, and sometimes the true things are the simple ones.